Hi, I'm Laureen Sims. I'm excited to share our fall webinar, which is titled The Impact of Language Deprivation or Language Suppression upon Deaf Bilingual Learners. Now, we'll talk about three things. First, we will define the root cause and impact of language deprivation and language suppression. We'll talk about that. Next, practical strategies and remedies. Third, we'll have an opportunity for a question and answer session. These are the things we'll do. Now, first, let's define the underlying root cause and impact of language deprivation and language suppression. First, I'll talk about the deaf epistemology framework. This means the deaf ways of knowing. That's how I sign it. But there has not been enough documentation or research on this. Nowadays, more and more deaf researchers are involved in studying the inclinations of deaf people's way of learning and how they experience the world during their upbringings. So I use the deaf epistemology framework, signed this way, a lot through my work, studies, and research. More and more people are also using that framework. So you'll see me use that from time to time, and it's strongly based on deaf epistemology. Why would we use that framework? Because it's related to the ideological systemization, normalization. That's how, in social contexts, normalization means the acceptance or integration of marginalized individuals or oppressed groups or individuals into the mainstream audiocentric society. The deaf epistemology framework challenges this perception by showing that those of us who are deaf and have experienced deaf upbringings have experiences and views that are distinct from the mainstream audiocentric society. That's an important quote on screen. Deaf children are not hearing children who can't hear. That's a very different concept. It's a way of deaf epistemology that is predominantly based on the deaf experience, not hearing children who cannot hear. That's very different. Now, let's discuss the key differences between language deprivation and language suppression. They sometimes may seem similar, and they may even overlap at times, so it's hard to distinguish which is which. It may help to have examples that provide a clearer distinction in relation to timing. With timing, there are conscious decisions versus the critical period, the time when the body and mind progress and develop. That's called the critical period. And then choices can be either voluntary or involuntary. These are different. And then consequences in terms of reduced proficiency and profound language deficits. The distinction between the three is crucial, and I'll go into the differences of each. Now, talking about timing. Conscious decisions are part of language suppression, where they tell you, yes, you can do that, or no, you can't do that. That's suppression. For the critical period between birth and ages 0 to 3, this timing is precious because that's when the mind is developing and receiving information from our surroundings. But if language exposure is not there, that's language deprivation. Next, for choices. Voluntary is when a person says, I can decide, I know what I'm doing. That's language suppression, where you can make choices. Involuntary is when a deaf baby is born and a parent doesn't know what to do. They're told by audiologists and speech therapists not to use sign language. That's language deprivation. Next is consequences. With language suppression, you'll see the child's language become stagnant in proficiency. With language deprivation, it has an impact later on. If the child has no language exposure from ages 0 to 3 or even 4 or 5, it will impact the rest of that person's life. I've seen some Gallaudet students who clearly experienced language deprivation in their early years, and it's impacted them for the rest of their lives, where they struggle with reading, writing, and with learning, and that's because their minds were formed way back then. I'd like to divert a bit from this topic to talk about sign language deprivation. Some people think, wow, the parents aren't communicating with their baby. That's language deprivation. I'm hesitant about saying that because it may not be the appropriate wording. Parents typically will follow what they're told by doctors and society. Parents mean well. Even my own parents. My parents were told to not allow me to sign, but would I call that language deprivation? No. The system itself created language deprivation and caused well-meaning parents to withhold language. So we have to be careful about how we describe language deprivation, especially to parents. Our society and the system instruct parents to never sign and that they must speak. And so the parents, for different reasons, listen to the advice of professionals like doctors and audiologists. So we have to be careful about how we label language deprivation. We're not talking about the parents. Rather, we're talking about society at large and the system. As I said, normalization is based on the influence of our audiocentric society. Now, see the slide? How do we define language deprivation? I'd like you to pause and watch this brief video so you can understand language deprivation more clearly. It's a short and sweet video, but will help you understand better. Equity at work, empowering more deaf professionals to grow. Now, in fact, deaf professionals comprise only 15% of the workforce, while hearing professionals comprise 85% of the workforce. That's really concerning. This is primarily because of testing and licensure. Testing requires the ability to read and write along with math for licensure too. So that really impacts deaf professionals. Remember where deaf professionals come from and their backgrounds and schooling. We have to go all the way back to their infant days. That has a strong impact. So that 15% of deaf professionals are crucial language models for young children and even up to college-age students. We need that because deaf professional numbers are dwindling to 15%. That's something to keep in mind. And we need to encourage and empower more deaf people to join the field and serve as wonderful language models as they work with hearing professionals. Take a moment to look at this slide. It's quite interesting to see how testing has really impacted the low number of deaf professionals. Notice the large percentage of deaf people not passing the praxis test, 74%. Contrastingly, hearing people have a 30% pass rate, and hard of hearing people have a 70% pass rate. That's significant. More than half don't pass the test. The test fail rate is something to explore. Now that we've discussed the deaf population, let's explore ethnic backgrounds, race, and BIPOC, and people of color. The pass rate drastically drops. Look at the deaf Black percentage, 0 passed, while 3 failed. For the Hawaiian group, none passed, while 4 failed. For the white group, 63 failed and 25 passed. That shows a significant impact of testing on the dwindling numbers of BIPOC, race, and ethnic groups. I often feel fed up when I encounter people who say, there are not enough Black deaf teachers. Currently, deaf students of color represent 55% of the student demographic. 55% and growing. Yet, there are still not enough teacher models who are representative of the children's demographics. There's a disparity. Let's look at more recent research. Fewer deaf people go to college. Fewer deaf people complete bachelor's degrees. These data show the impact of not having enough deaf professional teachers, teacher aides, and deaf people in other roles. It's really dwindling. This is based on my article published in 2008 entitled Apartheid in Deaf Education. Apartheid is a strong word, but it really does exist in deaf education. That distinct separation between the large number of white people and then the smaller group of deaf people of color and deaf persons too. Wow. It starts at birth with language deprivation and not being exposed to ASL and English. And that has a domino effect on parents. There may be some support services, but there are gaps. And then in preschool and elementary school and thereafter, the curriculum isn't designed for the deaf experience nor deaf epistemology. Rather, the curriculum is taken from others and adapted to accommodate our deaf children's experiences. And then in college, for the bachelor's, master's, or doctoral degrees, it becomes more challenging to pass through the bottle. There are so few deaf people of color who reach the doctoral level or professional level. That's how it impacts us from birth until later in life and creates the bottleneck. Watch a video that provides more explanation about this. Almost 2 years ago, when Lead K here in Oregon was passed, about 2 years ago, we initially got data about deaf and hard of hearing children in the school system. In the area of language acquisition, it was blatantly clear they were all behind. All of the kids failed the kindergarten assessments. Now, 2 years later, there's been another data set recently released within the past few days. That data shows that deaf and hard of hearing kids are still delayed. However, this time, the data was added that showed deaf and hard of hearing people of color were lagging even more. That's concerning, and we need to focus on that gap. They have to catch up to the standards. This cycle runs clockwise, starting with language deprivation, which is followed by underserved agencies for families and children. There aren't many of them. The next part of the cycle is the impoverished curriculum, which often doesn't suit deaf children, which contributes to the unprepared high school learners who arrive at college not ready, and then pedagogy and higher education and qualified professionals, testing, certification, licensure are problematic. And that's a never-ending vicious cycle. Now I've talked about the root cause and underlying problems. That was the first part. And I've shared a distinction between language deprivation and language suppression and the different impacts. Now we'll move on to practical strategies and remedies. How can we be present to answer these questions and significant issues? What are practical strategies? First, we'll discuss critical pedagogy and what you do in school. Then, language-based approaches versus grammar-based approaches. And third, the communicative language model. I'll go into detail on each. First up is critical pedagogy. Read this quote quickly. Critical pedagogy is not new. It's been around in many fields in the educational system. It looks at teaching approaches that really help students question, challenge, and think critically about domination and the beliefs and practices that dominate. In other words, it is a theory and practice of helping students achieve critical consciousness. That means you're teaching them how to question and challenge. You're causing them to answer questions and engage in debate, how to cause students to engage in that discussion. And that's really important. What you do with your teachings in the classroom is not only in the classroom. It can also be workshops, conferences, in different settings. But critical pedagogy is about what you do with the learners. This is one of my favorite books by Paulo Freire. He writes about radical pedagogy. And then we have Lisa Delpit, which talks about cultural pedagogy. We'll discuss both perspectives, and I recommend you read these books. So what do children experience in school? What do teachers teach children? What are we being taught? And also, culturally, in the curriculum, it's strongly white people-based or whitewash programming that isn't always suited for children, or even some are ideologically based, which does not fit deaf children's experiences. So these two books are good. Now I'll talk about the impact of language suppression and how this happens. Providing input and interacting with students or babies of any age is important. They put everything in a black box. That's actually the brain, but I always liken the brain to a black box. This black box is essential. It has a strong mechanism for language acquisition in place. that is ready to absorb and process the input it receives. Over time, as it accumulates the input, it then provides output. I want to share my experience with my hearing son. My older 2 children are deaf, while my 3rd child is a coda. I'll never forget this. One day he went to school and came home. As we chatted at the dinner table, I asked my children what they did at school and what were a few things they learned and all that. My coda son was a very expressive boy and would talk about so much. He was young. This was when he was small. We'd all watch him with awe while he talked, and I told him, wow, that's rich information there. He shrugged and said, that's just what I hear. As I thought about that, it hit me. My son had language at home through signing and the TV volume turned on. So yes, he was exposed to a lot of language. But when he went to school, he would get on the bus and it become an audio-centric environment for him because the students and the driver would talk. Sound was all around him all the time, feeding him. And then when he got to school, there were teachers standing in the hallway and they'd speak, giving him full access through hearing. Then in the classroom, the teacher would start teaching and he learned, and then he'd come back home with the same auditory input on the bus. All of that in one day. And then at nighttime, he'd chat with us at dinner. Wow. And then I looked at my deaf son and it was so different. The bus would come and my son's bus driver didn't talk and didn't sign. He would just drive. The driver and aide would sit there not talking to him. Everyone would ride the bus silently. And even though there were some hearing students on the bus, it was quiet until he arrived at school. He was mainstreamed at that time, and most of the teachers were hearing and would speak instead of signing in the hallway. There was no input through signing. It was only when he got to the classroom that the teacher finally would sign good morning. That's it, out of the entire day, and then he'd be back on the same bus ride home. There was a big gap in the input of my 2 sons. My hearing son had higher input, was higher in language, reading, and writing. Plus, he had incidental hearing. So it's important for you to continually expose your parents, friends, families to the importance of using sign language. Also, when my daughter gave birth to a deaf child, she asked me what to do. I said, go ahead and sign as much as you can. Go ahead and say everything under the moon. And I cautioned her to watch because the baby would respond. She signed all the time. Even when shopping at the food store and picking out food, it's like talking to yourself with the baby in your arms or in the shopping cart. Even if the baby's eyes wander, they're listening. Even if they seem they aren't watching, they are getting that input visually if we sign all the time. Then her son grew a bit and started hounding his mom. Why? His mom had to explain things and could see how his language has exploded. It was amazing. She tried to figure out why his language exploded, and I told her, it's you. You're the mother who signs all the time, and that's the input. So that is key. As a deaf person grows up and gets that input, it gets stored in that black box, and the input accumulates over time and then converts into output. But if we don't provide that input, that's language suppression. That's controlling and providing minimal input to the language. I'll give you some more examples. Language suppression, as it says here, the further a learner falls behind with a lack of vocabulary or a lack of something, perhaps a lack of reading, what do? The prevailing standard is to bombard that student with more training, more skills-based practice, and more memorization by rote. This is with the best intentions. Often an adult will sit with the child and give more vocabulary, more grammar, more writing and spelling and practice repetitively. But oddly, the student will still fall behind instead of making gains. Often the student falls behind because this isn't language. It is not language. The student needs a holistic, comprehensive language access approach through signing. That's when the student can sit and have a full conversation with that foundation and discuss terms. But it's often the other way around. When students are delayed, people think, oh, let's try increased skill building through vocabulary, grammar, and training. That's called language suppression, where everything is memorized by rote. That's Paulo's article about radical pedagogy. And it's true. Both hearing education and deaf education are deeply rooted in the banking concept of education, where information is fed to students, deposited in their minds. Students receive those deposits of information and then graduate, but they lack that dialogic language and critical thinking skills. That's a great lack of that. Paulo identified that as a problem. We want students to be able to think critically and consciously ask questions of the dominant society. That depends on your pedagogy. Do you subscribe to the banking approach of having students memorize by rote, drill, and practice? That's something critical pedagogy challenges. Now, second, we'll talk about language-based versus grammar-based approaches. This is very controversial. There are different philosophies. It's good for you to listen to all of them. There's no right or wrong, black or white. I'm just sharing what my beliefs and my deaf epistemology are. It's true that grammar-based resources are rich because it's a remedial approach where we fix and pursue repair of student skills through training and rote. There are plenty of published resources for this, and many deaf education teachers love this approach because it's easy to control and record. However, language-based resources, whether American Sign Language or spoken, resources are very limited. It's more challenging, and I'll explain why. Grammar-based resources are common all over. That includes me. I grew up loving the Fitzgerald Key because it was color-coded. I enjoyed writing it. It's not bad. No, it's good and has uses. But what's the goal in terms of critical pedagogy? We need to analyze that. Children are really adept at writing grammar, such as knowing they isn't correct. They're excellent at doing that and love the workbooks and homework and all of that. The schools use that skill a lot. They focus heavily on grammar, vocabulary, and memorization, which have benefits. But when it comes to free writing, discussions, or presentations, that's where the students' limitations show and become evident. I've seen many college students like that, where they have to present and they struggle to use language freely or to think freely. That's a red flag, and it's concerning. If you see someone struggling, you know why. Look at their upbringing and see if they experienced language training through the banking model. Maybe they had language deprivation as babies, and that has a ripple effect. Language is key. There is no magic to it like some people might think. It's language. Language is the black box, and it's crucial to have all input fed into that black box. All that information, all that comprehension, and figuring out the rules is natural and inherent. Language-based resources tend to be developed by deaf people who have deaf epistemology and who know what deaf kids need. Poetry, rhythmic use of the hands, storytelling, and so forth. Deaf children absolutely love these resources. It motivates them to learn and play with their hands and language. But the challenge is that these resources require receptive and expressive language skills, especially with benchmarks at specific ages. Remember, deaf professionals only comprise 15% of the field, while 85% are hearing. So, where are the language models who can show how to play with language, who have that experience and a deaf view of the world? So, what can we do and how can we support language? Learners should be engaged with whole, authentic discourse and conversation. That will then lead to mastery of language, which will occur naturally. It's no secret. Simply interact and converse with children. That's all they need. Children of all ages. Third, the communicative language teaching model is a really old model that has been practiced over the years, although it hasn't been used in deaf education very much. It's the most important one. I strongly encourage the use of this model. I really do. I'll explain what it involves. Real dialogic communication. Teaching includes everyday situations and happenings and engaging the learner in interactions about those situations. Learners then experience the real-life aspects of those situations through these interactions. It's important they see and make connections and make sense of the information. For example, arriving late at the airport, so you can explain to the child through engaging them in conversation that we're late, we have to hurry and arrive, grab the suitcases. Or you drive to the food store and realize it's closed. Darn, we have to look for another store. Real life situations become interactive so children can learn the reasons for things, and the back and forth conversation between the child and adult will help. Start very young until the children are older. Start when they're babies. Watch these 3 videos and study how the families interact and really bond. Their interactions are natural. I give you time to watch each family. Starting with the mother. See what the mother is doing? The mother is putting her hand on the baby and signing on the baby, touching the baby as the baby looks on. Babies do listen. Do not underestimate babies. Even if they don't react or look away, input is happening. Expose the babies and feed them with information. Babies do listen with their eyes and ears. Next, the Mexican family has the little boy talking to his brother and father. And then the third is of me with my grandson a long time ago. It's fascinating how interaction takes place in real situations with deep thoughts. It's not about vocabulary or specific words. The vocabulary learning takes place through meaningful interactions and connections. Now, let's look at high schools. Look at the interaction and pay attention to how they help each other take turns in the dialogue or discourse. They tend to talk more in reality, but in class, it tends to be the banking model and lectures. It's a big difference. So I'll give you time to look at it. It's not easy because there are a lot of overlapping conversations, but it's important to observe and then incorporate this into your teaching for communication and language. Now, college students. This is challenging too. Watch the back and forth and bantering that takes place. It's important that you can understand, and then it will help with the discussion. Whenever I teach, I have to pay close attention to the discussion taking place and interact with them. I serve as a language model, and they look to me to model actual situations. Now, I'd like you to observe this conversation between older deaf adults. Take careful note of how the listener is watching as the person narrates. Watch her facial expressions. Feedback is key, such as nodding, making facial expressions rather than maintaining a stoic look. You have to have that back and forth conversation. So it's important to have that intuitive feedback. Language and grammar. How do you decide which to use? Both are beneficial. So you don't have to get rid of either. Both are beneficial. But how do you help develop children's thinking and learning? I recommend that once children arrive in your classroom, they are in that pre-readiness stage and their abilities may not be shown fully. So provide more language. As you can see here in the blue area, you use language-based approaches primarily until the child has well-developed language, and then use more grammar-based approaches to balance that out. Always continue teaching both grammar and language constantly. Observe them and develop their language foundation. They'll then have greater understanding and meaning, connecting what they read with what you explain. But if you start with grammar, vocabulary, and spelling, they'll be learning by rote and excel at memorization. That's the banking concept at work. That means they'll find it challenging to creatively think or organically think. How do you show the differences between acquisition and interaction and learning? Take a look at this comparison. Acquisition is implicit, subconscious, done without really thinking. It's strongly based on interactions and often receives high input without consciously knowing it. It usually happens in informal situations rather than intimidating environments. When people relax and chat, they tend to acquire more language. The grammatical part is more intuitive or feeling, such as facial expressions, learning through back and forth interactions. Attitude is another one. Are they willing to learn and motivated to learn, or are they paralyzed and afraid that they cannot stray from the rules? they are told they have to learn this for testing, and this makes acquisition harder. If you have an attitude where your mind and heart are open and you feel free, you'll acquire language faster. Learning is explicit and conscious. It's tangible, and the teacher says, this is what it is. Rules, rules, rules. It's found in formal situations where the teacher says, you can do this, but not this. Where you say you have to do this and you can't do this. It's very formal learning, and grammatical rules are followed. And it also depends on aptitude, which is different from attitude. Aptitude refers to your abilities and if you have depth epistemology and experience. Some don't have that because it goes back again to their infant years in language deprivation. That ripple effect influences their abilities to acquire language and even learn. Now I'll give you examples of activities. Language acquisition is found within natural conversational flows and visual narrative discoveries. This can be in stories. Children just love ASL stories. It also involves engaging with peers, colleagues, and linguistic models. Language learning involves vocabulary building strategies, reiterative and competency-centric methodology, and grammar-based approaches. Both are beneficial, but it depends on your goals based on your observations of the children. It's true for college-age students too. There are some I can easily work with while others I have to make adaptations for. Now, people are always wanting assessments. Yeah, assessments for the language-based approach is really difficult. It's very subjective and intuitive, which is tough. Grammar-based assessments are available with checklists. It's a popular approach, and teachers often use that for IEP meetings and planning, especially with children's milestones and goals. Using that system is easy because it's easier to measure and track. Like maybe the child knew 20 out of 40 words previously, and now the child knows 30 of 40. Great! That shows an improvement and is measurable. So people are happy and their egos are boosted. Really? What about language interaction and expressive language? If not, which one do you feel is more valuable? That's the challenge. Which philosophy do you use? A common assessment format is anecdotal, where you take notes and record observations. Some people will set up video cameras and leave it. Not all day, but during specific times, like during meals or playtime or interactive situations like story time. You can take that clip of maybe 10 to 15 minutes, although it's still a lot of work to do. And then we have a running record observation, which could be done from videos or direct observations. You then record notes of what you see repeatedly, or you can use a rubric of evaluation criteria for conversations, such as the child listening, interrupting, staying on topic or not, and so forth. There are different assessment tools you can use, but they can be challenging and are quite subjective. Modeling. Here are a few do's. Have the desire to engage in meaningful conversations on relevant topics and take turns appropriately during conversations. You can teach this during class using the communicative language model. Use that to teach how to take turns in conversations. For the don'ts, avoid depending solely on repetition and drills. Next, refrain from criticizing or correcting. That's not the goal. The child will self-adapt language and screen the information. The child will see how things are communicated around them, and the language will naturally adapt. Now, going back to the impact of 85% of professionals being hearing. They serve an important role. They have an impact and contribute to deaf children. If they learn signing and practice it, they can still have an important role. Never reject hearing people. Always welcome their involvement and support. Their presence can help teach children who then grow up and expand the number of deaf professionals. Watch this video of a hearing teacher who shares her experiences and her story. I'll talk about 2 decisions I made in my over 20-year career in deaf education. The first decision happened a long time ago when I was a young, new teacher. I decided I wanted to make sure that my behavior, my actions, and my remarks showed I valued ASL. For me, that looks like chatting with a hearing coworker, and we both know sign language and continuing to sign, not using simultaneous communication, but signing regardless of where we are, whether it's the cafeteria, in the hallway, in the parking lot, at the playground, or the front office. And it didn't matter if any deaf people were around, we still continue signing. That really helped my mind and body integrate to ASL at all times. It also meant I had to assess my own signing skills and become willing to listen to feedback from deaf adults and more experienced signers. I had to realize that it wasn't criticism. Rather, it helps me improve, which means it helps me serve deaf children better. I'm really grateful for the many patient and caring deaf adults through these 20 years who have made me a better signer. The second decision actually happened 3 weeks ago through a conversation with a deaf coworker. I realized I had to apologize for being a hearing person in a deaf space. She told me, no, really, as a person, you are open and value ASL and you continually try to improve all the time. That's an important message for deaf children. As a hearing capable person, you're willing to value ASL, which means you're important, you're worth it. And it's also a good message for hearing parents of deaf children too. This is my favorite quote from Margaret Mead. This quote is exactly right. Engaging conversations is the art of sustained discourse. It's not a minor deal or easy to elicit information from children. It's important that we teach children how to think, not what to think. That's what Paulo's point was. It's not about banking. It's more of figuring out how to teach students to respond and ask questions thoughtfully. So, in summary, language is the emphasis. Language deprivation is when language is lacking, and language suppression is when language is missing. They both tie into the point that language is important in both situations. From birth until the child gets older, we need to keep an eye on the child during class, throughout curricula and programs, and even all the way through college until the child's senior citizen years. Language is the answer. Okay, that's a wrap. You have the opportunity to evaluate my presentation and share feedback, ideas, and suggestions for our next webinar. We will have a webinar around April of 2024. I believe we will announce it. Donations would be appreciated to help cover the cost of captioning, voice interpretation, and support for webinar access for all of you. Your donations would be appreciated, and you can scan the QR code you see here. I'd also like to promote our Jump Start program next summer. That's for new Gallaudet freshmen who come to campus not knowing sign language. We provide support through a language immersion approach. So feel free to share that information with your people or friends who want to attend Gallaudet as freshmen but don't sign. They are welcome, and we have a program for them that is aligned with our philosophy of crucial language exposure so they can feel like whole persons. You can click on the link too for more information about the Jump Start program. These are the references if you want them. Any questions? Contact cbo@gallaudet.edu and I'll take a look and we can have a discussion. So long, thank you, and have a great day. Bye.